I've noticed a shocking lack of reviews for the Sony A7V, so I decided I better make one. And I would like to thank Sony for not sending me a camera so my review won't have any appearance of bias. In order to buy the Sony A7V, I sold my A7IV and my A7S3. I've been searching for the perfect hybrid camera for a few years now. The Sony A7IV took amazing photographs with 33 megapixels, but when it came to video, I wanted nothing more than 4K 120 frames per second so I could do my squirrel cinematography. It did 4K 60 with an APS-C crop, but 60 frames per second isn't always enough slow motion to film fast-moving squirrels. When I managed to get a great deal on the Sony A7S3, I was delighted to finally be able to do 4K 120, and the low light capabilities were excellent with a second base ISO of 12,800. But whenever I wanted to photograph a squirrel, I felt limited by the 12 megapixels. And the Sony A7S3 didn't have animal eye detect, so I'd missed focus quite a bit. When I heard the Sony A7V would be able to do 4K 120, I was ready to pull out my Paybu credit card at B&H Photo. I was disappointed to find out it would have an APS-C crop, but when I heard it would have the Bion's XR2 processor and be able to do the same AI autofocus that I love in the ZVE1, I was ready for an upgrade. It's amazing at tracking an animal's eye. When I received the A7V, the first thing I noticed is that the grip was a little bit more comfortable than the A7IV, but everything else looked pretty identical. But I wasn't prepared for one accessibility feature that's changed everything for me as a visually impaired photographer. The screen reader now does so much more than just reading a few menu items.
Still image movie, ISO 10,000. Select with the up-down button. ISO 16,000, ISO 20,000, ISO 12,000.
The fact that the screen reader reads the ISO settings has changed everything for me. This has meant so much to me when I'm outdoors and I can't really read the screen. When I was filming an S-Log3 at the nature park, I had accidentally left my ISO set to 8,000 from the night before when I was filming in low light indoors. And normally this would be a huge pain point for me trying to get the ISO back to 800, but since the screen reader was able to read each increment out loud, I felt like I had so much more control over my filming. Besides the screen reader, another feature in the Sony A7V that I found incredibly useful is the AI auto white balance. I have to admit, I've never been one that goes around doing custom white balance.
I carry a gray card with me vlogging. Take that white balance.
What really impressed me is when I was using a flash to photograph my Christmas village, I forgot to switch the white balance to flash, and normally I get a really nasty yellow cast to my photographs, but the auto white balance really came through for me. One of the first things I decided to test on the Sony A7V was the IBIS. I hate using gimbals, and this camera is supposed to have up to 7 stops of stabilization. What I was most excited to see is that it has a dynamic steady shot that I had grown to love in the ZVE1. It crops in about 30%, but it is so stable. I decided to try out my stabilization test with a non-Sony lens. I used the Sigma 16 to 28mm. Third-party lenses don't communicate as well with the camera stabilization settings, so I figured this would be a perfect test. It also gives you a chance to hear the quality of the camera's built-in microphone. I would like to thank Sony for not sending me the Sony A7V. This is a steady shot completely turned off at 16mm. This is with steady shot turned completely off. This is standard steady shot at 16mm. This is with steady shot turned to standard. This is the active steady shot at 16mm. This is active steady shot. This is a dynamic active steady shot at 16mm. This is dynamic steady shot. A major concern I had in parting with the Sony A7S3 is losing out on the incredible dynamic range. It supposedly had up to 15 stops, and I really enjoyed it. The Sony A7IV had about 14 stops of dynamic range, but with the A7V, they report it has 16 stops. And when I took it out at sunrise, I was actually surprised at how much detail I was able to get in the shadows. Now these are only JPEGs because I forgot to set the camera up for RAW plus JPEG, but frankly I was blown away. When filming animals in 4K 120, I was delighted to see that the Sony A7V was able to put a box around the animal's eye. Even though the Sony A7IV had animal eye detect in video, it couldn't detect the animal eye in the higher frame rate of 120, even though it was only HD. For filming in low light, I was concerned that the Sony A7V would be much noisier than the Sony A7S3. When you film in S-Log3, the Sony A7S3 has a second base ISO of 12,800, and the Sony A7V has a second base ISO of 8,000. I was a little concerned, but going through these clips, the noise seems minimal, and even when I can see it, it's much finer than the noise on the Sony A7S3. I was worried that the APS-C crop in 4K 120 would be a deal breaker, but for wildlife, the crop turned out to be an advantage, and I didn't find the noise to be so much of an issue. I did try out the HD 120 frames per second just to see what the quality would be like, and I was quite impressed. It seems more detailed than it did on the Sony A7IV. I really did notice the advantage of the IBIS in the A7V when using telephoto lenses. Whenever I would use a Sigma 100 to 400mm lens with the Sony A7IV, I normally would use standard steady shot and let the Sigma lens do all the work, because whenever I would use active steady shot, it really seemed to fight against the Sigma. But with the A7V, even though the standard mode still works really well, active steady shot seems a lot smoother, and even though I normally film in 120 frames per second to get smooth footage, I found with the Sony A7V, even at 60 frames per second, I was able to get decent footage, especially when I was able to use dynamic steady shot. A feature on the Sony A7V that I didn't know I'd appreciate so much is the automatic subject detection. On the Sony A7IV, I'd often forget to change the subject from human to animal to bird, but with the Sony A7V, you can select auto and it'll do the thinking for you. Chris from Petapixel says it works better if you do select animal or human or insect. I tend to agree with that, but auto detection works great if you're in one of those situations where your subject is rapidly changing. After using the Sony A7V for about a week now, I've asked myself, do I regret selling the A7IV and the A7S3? And the honest answer is, I do miss the Sony A7S3 just a little bit. It does remain the king of low-light shooting, but with the Sony A7V's advanced autofocusing features and improved IBIS and dynamic range, I may not miss the Sony A7S3 for long. It is possible that the Sony A7V takes out some of the challenge of photography with its AI autofocus and white balancing capabilities, but with someone who has a visual impairment, I find these features to be a great asset, and I especially appreciate the fact that it can read the ISO settings. If you like this video, give it a like, consider subscribing for more camera-related content from a newbie like me. God bless.